dear friend, and at one point I just looked at her, because we know each other long enough. Carol, where your hearing aids, babe. You're making it hard for all of us.
They say people at 60 or 65, some huge percentage have hearing.
Yeah, they have a high frequency loss. Now, there's other conditions like auditory figure ground where they can't, if there's a noisy environment,
It's also
then it's hard to focus on who's speaking and what, yeah, but anyway. I'm not there yet.
good.
I got other issues. We're going to escape it?
Yeah,
No, we're not going to
Yeah,
escape
hearing
it.
is an easier issue to do.
Yeah, yeah. Some people reject. They do reject having hearing aid. Okay. So I just have a quickie to start. Yes.
Are they similar, or it's anybody who gets a notice, which is the book I'm getting?
Yes, it is. Now, we send out the flyers to assisted livings, you know, the very large adult communities.
So it's not just members.
No, we have people come from other synagogues. We have friends of members. Friends of members. Yeah, so. And then we have potential new members. I don't know. You know what? You live in a where you have neighbors, and so there were many times where there were things going on, and we had a rooster, chicken coops of our neighbor, and every morning. We've had dogs. Yeah. It's just living with the community. I don't know. Edith, you're asking me to explain something. I can't explain anybody's actions.
For a job that I had years ago in New York, I was living on Central Park West, and my office was on, well, near Fifth Avenue in the 60s. So every morning I would walk across the
How lucky.
Yeah. And sometimes there was a guy out there playing his trumpet. And I could understand he couldn't do that. I said,
But that's oh my God. No, it would not be good interacting. All right, I will. Yeah. So I have your introduction remarks, and then I definitely say about time and questions and answers.
it doesn't take too much of me. I mean,
Right.
I hope that my scan doesn't obliterate their view of the...
Then, all right, so ladies and gentlemen, if you cannot see the screen comfortably, then I'll just request move to where you are the most comfortable visually. Okay? Careful, Phyllis. 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 Anita. Anita. When do you want the lights off? When? No.
Let me just ask you a question. Are the lights to everything on for everyone to see the screen?
Yes.
Dim it.
Yeah, they should definitely dim them.
Yeah. We certainly don't expect one answer from this crew. I'm just saying. Okay, yeah, all righty. Read what? Okay. Are we all good? Okay, wonderful. Welcome, shalom, to those attending today's program in person and on live stream. My name is Maddie Kalb, and along with Brenda Tulla. Brenda, are you here? No. She was still in the kitchen. We co-chair MRT's Adult Education Committee, which is an active, dynamic group of people who provide a lineup of Jewish-based programs in person, Zoom, live stream, that often connect the past, the present, and the future. Today's program, The Jews of China, is presented by Dr. Edith Rogovin Frankel, a professor, historian, and author. She will tell the story of the ancient Jews of Kaifeng, as well as the settlement of Jews in Shanghai and elsewhere in China, starting in the 19th century. Whether you seek individual or group engagement by Zoom or in person in this room, there's a place for everyone to thrive at MRT because it has so much to offer. One path is through adult education programs presented by outstanding and carefully vetted speakers, such as our speaker today. Your presence within our temple walls is vital and contributes to Jewish life, family strength, and the well-being of the greater Jewish community. May this year be a time to fit in adult Jewish learning, where as Jews and as Americans, we study diverse topics, listen to one another, and develop tolerance and respect for multiple perspectives. As adult role models, we bring wisdom and guidance to younger people. Our need for educational, spiritual, and community engagement and improved communication has never been as great as it is now. And now it is my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Edith Rogovin Frankel. Our presenter has an extensive educational and teaching background. She lived in Jerusalem for many years and taught at the Hebrew University. She has also taught at Stanford University, Dartmouth College, and University College London. She's no slouch. Oh, I didn't write that. She taught at Monmouth University and in New York City at Hunter College. She has numerous publications. Her latest book, Old Lives and New: Soviet Immigrants in Israel and America, focuses on the emigration of the Jews from the Soviet Union in the 1970s. Dr. Frankel will be teaching a course beginning this November at Brookdale Community's lifelong learning program entitled On Both Sides of the Atlantic, the Jews of England and Argentina. I understand that the class is full, and when asked if she wouldn't mind extending the population in your class, I believe you said, sure. So there might be some spots still. Check it out on Brookdale Community Lifelong Learning. I just want to share with you in terms of interactions with this size audience, it will be very difficult to have interactions. So we will wait until the end of the presentation, and then we will open it up to your questions and some dialoguing. Thank you so much. It is an absolute privilege to be here, to stand here, to be part of this Jewish community, to work with the entire Adult Education Committee. Anything you need?
I'm good. Well, good afternoon. I'm going to be showing a lot of slides, maps, pictures, and so on. So anybody whose view is obfuscated by this thing should move to a better viewpoint, unless you don't like pictures. We're going to be talking today about, to me, an absolutely fascinating subject, and a rather unusual one, because when you think China, you don't usually think Jews. And yet, Jews have lived in China for over 1,000 years. We're not going to be following just one group from start to finish. We're going to be interjecting a number of groups as they appear on the scene. Just to explain it to you, it may be a bit confusing. I'll be throwing a lot of facts at you, but I hope you'll get the general picture of what this wonderful history is all about. First of all, by the way, is there a light here at all? Any light? I just need something here to look at my notes. Jews were historically involved in commerce, going all the way back to prehistoric times, to biblical times. We know that they plied the trade route from the Middle East, certainly, all the way to India and China for a very, very long time. So that should come as no surprise to anybody. By the 10th century, we're talking about 1,000 years ago, the main trade route from the Middle East, and before it from Europe, to China became going by sea. Is this clear enough for you? Can you manage that? So you can see all the way through the Mediterranean, that's by sea. And then in order to get down here, you had to do some crossing of land masses. There were no... Oh, great, brilliant. They should make you president of the congregation. And so this was a route plied not only in general, but by Jews in particular. The Jews not only sailed on the ships, they also owned ships, they captained them, they were involved in every part of the commercial process. And the port cities in China, a number of them had large enough Jewish congregations or communities at that time that they literally also had synagogues. These were synagogue communities that existed until the beginning of the Ming Dynasty in the 15th century. I'm not sure this is really clear enough, but what you're seeing here is one ship fighting against another ship, and one of the ships is pirates, and the other is the Ming Dynasty. And so we have, the Jews were not the pirates. So they, under the Ming Dynasty, they told the people in the port cities that they could the foreigners, that they could no longer protect them against pirates. The other main way that people got to China from the Middle East was by caravan along the ancient Silk Road, and I'm sure that you've heard of the Silk Road. It had many routes. You can see there's one that's northern, there's one that goes here, and so on. But they all lead over to China. And it was probably the northern route that was most used by the Jewish traders, starting around the 6th century. And that was partly, I think, because large parts of the Silk Road were protected. There's a map of you can see many, many different routes, all part of the general Silk Road. Protected by the Khazars. Now, I don't know how many of you know the word Khazar? Okay. The Khazars were a nomadic or semi-nomadic people of Turkic origin who lived in the area of the northern Caucasus Mountains. And in the 8th century, for reasons I can't go into now because we've got to get forward to China, but in the 9th century, the leaders of the Khazar group converted to Judaism. And gradually, the whole group became Jewish. So they're a very unusual, but they deserve a lecture on their own. So I just want to explain to you that, let me see if I have a picture here. This is where you see where it says Khazaria? So this is the Black Sea, the Mediterranean's over here, Caspian Sea, and this is the area of the Khazars. Again, it's very clear this time where it says Khazar Empire in red, and one more just to clarify it. So that's the area. And they took tolls for use of their portions of the Silk Road, but they also protected people. And so Jewish merchants would have felt fairly safe going through areas controlled by fellow Jews. So we know that Jews were traveling, like Marco Polo, were traveling from someplace in Europe, certainly the Middle East, all the way over towards China. And about 100 years ago, a cave was discovered which had a treasure trove of Buddhist documents. It was almost an archive. Now, if you look very carefully, you'll see a man here. And that's Paul Pelliot. He was a French archaeologist who discovered this. You see, these are all old ancient manuscripts and parchments and so on, piled up in a cave. And among the various scrolls and parchments and so on, they also found Hebrew texts. Again, here, the lighting isn't good enough, but I think you can probably make out that this is Chinese, this is Hebrew writing, indicating that people who carried with them their prayers, perhaps a Torah, we don't know what they took with them, but items of Jewish interest were coming through this area and into China. And there's written evidence of the presence of Jews in China in its earliest form in a document from the 8th century that was found. And it was a business letter about sheep, obviously. What else would one write a business letter about? And it's written in Judeo-Persian, which you know how Yiddish is a Germanic-based language written in Hebrew letters. So Judeo-Persian was a Persian language written in Hebrew letters, okay? And this is just a part of it. When they pieced it together, that's what it looked like. They put together all those different parts of it. And it was written on paper. Paper was only made in China at that time. So that's of interest as well. And now we get to the Jews of Kaifeng. We can only say what their possible origins are, but because of various documents and historical records, it is believed that they were Persian Jews. Now remember, after the fall of the temple, if I may go back 2,000 years, we get this great diaspora of Jews moving to all sorts of different places within the Roman Empire and beyond it, and so on. And a certain number of Jews settled in Persia, but they settled in all sorts of places. As long as they were in trade, they were involved in helping merchants, exchanging goods, and so on and so forth. So it is believed that it was a group of Persian Jews who arrived in China at the time of the Sung dynasty. The Sung, that's not misspelt. It's spelt Song and it's called Sung. The Sung dynasty, you've got the dates there, and it's possibly in the 11th century or a little earlier, is when we think these Persian Jews came there with more than the idea of just bringing merchandise, but possibly even settling there. And although it's a long, long time ago, you may think, well, it must have been a very primitive kind of place. And so I want you to look at the porcelain that comes out of the Sung dynasty, which is absolutely exquisite, beautifully made with wonderful glazes and so on. So this is from the period when these Persian Jews probably arrived. And the source for our knowing this are from stelae, that is, stones that were inscribed. And I'll show you what they look like. I won't read them to you. They're in Chinese. There's another one. Now, but you can see this is written hundreds of years later. So it's what, a grandparent told a grandchild and so on and so forth. So we can't depend on this entirely, but this is what we think. Now, where was Kaifeng? Not where you might think. It was, in fact, in what I would call the middle of nowhere. And to show you where the middle of nowhere is, that's Kaifeng. Okay? Now this is all China and the Yellow Sea, right? So that's Kaifeng. Yes, that's Kaifeng. I think I have another map. It was on the Yellow River. Now, what you're looking at here, this blue, that's the way the Yellow River meanders on all the way to the sea. So living in Kaifeng, although it was a great distance, they had access to the sea, which is why we think that even though the first Jews came to Kaifeng probably along the Silk Road, further Jews who came to join them possibly came by sea. And it was also connected, Kaifeng, the Yellow River, was also connected to the Yangtze, the Yangtze, by the Grand Canal. So it wasn't as in the middle of nowhere as it seems to be when you just look at the map. Of course, there were great distances and it took time but people made these trips and were in touch and did communicate with each other. When did the outside world know about this Chinese community? I'll tell you about them in a couple of minutes. It was only at the very beginning of the 17th century, a long, long, long time after these original Jews had settled in Kaifeng. A Jesuit priest, or monk, Jesuit, I'm not sure if he was a priest, whose name was Matteo Ricci, was in China probably as a missionary, but he was living there for a while, and they had some sort of house of worship in Beijing. And he came across a man called Ai Tian. Ai Tian was a Jew from Kaifeng, and he'd come to Beijing because he wanted to find out if he could get an imperial service appointment. You know, there was this whole Confucius kind of system in China where for every civil appointment you had to take examinations. And these were very difficult, and but if you passed it, you could get yourself a good job with the government. He ran into Ai Tian, and they started talking, and from what I understand, Ai Tian was totally clueless. He had no idea what a Christian was. And he thought that Ricci was probably some kind of Jew, because he also knew about the 5 books of Moses and so on. So it made sense that this was one of us. And he went into this house of worship with Ricci and saw a painting. Now, this is not the painting, because it's probably somewhere in China or disappeared forever, but it's a typical painting of the subject of the time. I'm sorry, this is in the body of a synagogue, but you'll excuse me. It's only momentary. It was a picture of Mary, the baby Jesus, and the other baby is John the Baptist. It's a common painting from the subject for a painting of the time. But Ai Tian, looking at this, thought, oh, because this is from his own point of view, this must be Rebecca with Esau and Jacob. So this sort of reinforced his belief that he was talking to some kind of fellow Jew from a distant place. It wasn't the case, and I'm not going to go into what happened after that, but he was the first European to learn about the Kaifeng Jews. And he wrote back to wherever it was that he came from in Italy and told them about this group. How did these Jews live? In the beginning, they were involved in growing cotton and in dyeing cotton cloth. And this goes back to the first Jews who came to Kaifeng because they brought cotton cloth as a tribute gift to the emperor at the time. There was no such thing as cotton in China, so this was something new for them. And they didn't grow cotton in China. But beyond that, once they started with cotton, they got into everything. Trade, they were in the military, they were in farming, they became artisans, physicians, and they got high civil service appointments. In terms of their religious life, we know that the first synagogue that they built was in 1193. So sometime after they got there, but obviously had already established themselves. Because, as you know, when a new Jewish community started someplace, whether it was way out in the West here when people were settling places, or whether it was when they came to a new town in Poland or whatever, the first thing that they did was not to build a synagogue. The first thing that they would build, what would be the first thing? First, they would establish ground for a cemetery. And of course, they would have to have a mikveh. That without a mikveh, you couldn't have procreation. So that was absolutely way before synagogue. So in 1163, during the time of the Northern Sung dynasty, they built a synagogue, and it was built and rebuilt over the years because of various things, fires and floods and so on. So just to give you a few pictures of, this doesn't exist anymore, and these are just assumed things. This is not a photograph of a synagogue. And that's the interior. You can see it was greatly influenced by Chinese architecture. They kept at least 13 beautiful Sifrei Torahs in fine containers on parchment. And this one is at the British Museum in London. So this is the real thing, and obviously from a very long time ago. What they kept in terms of religious practice, they kept kashrut. Their meat was ritually slaughtered. They had a shochet. They kept the Sabbath. They kept holidays. They had a sukkah for Sukkot. This is all information we get from these stelae that were inscribed later. 3 times a day they had prayers with a minyan, 10 men. They practiced circumcision of male children. And they had a modified stance against intermarriage. Now, you can imagine why. Because this was a group of men. Whether there were some women in the original group, one doesn't know. But eventually, these men had to marry. And so they intermarried with the surrounding population. And so after a few generations, all of the Kaifeng Jews looked Chinese and not like Persian Jews at all. Okay? And that's why they had a modified stance against intermarriage. We know that they were in contact with other Jewish communities in China, Ningpo, Hangzhou, et cetera, et cetera. These are over on the coast. But we know they had contact with them. For example, in 1492, a year that we know for other reasons, they obtained 2 Torah scrolls from Ningpo after they had a flood, which destroyed everything. So we know there was interaction with other Jewish communities, although the other Jewish communities, I don't know if they were intermarried or not. Very little was known about them from the outside. Aside from Ricci, whom I just showed you, in 1651, a book came out by a very famous Dutch Jew, Manasseh ben Israel. He wrote The Hope of Israel, and that provides the only evidence that any European Jews had ever heard of Kaifeng Jews. Okay? But as Chinese inhabitants, they were fully integrated. They were acculturated. They set up halls for their ancestors, just in the Chinese style. And this expressed filial piety, not worship, not ancestor worship. They had, in the outer parts of the synagogue, they had halls where incense was burned and so on, as it would be in a Chinese temple. So they acculturated to that extent without changing the bases of their religious Jewish practice. And as I said, many of them took the examinations to become magistrates, judges, and so on and so forth. And apparently a very high percentage of the examinees did pass these examinations, of these Kaifeng Jews. The problem was that the government prohibited people from practicing being a judge or whatever in their own hometown. You had to be sent someplace else. They had to serve elsewhere. And so this may have had a serious effect on the community, because many of their best and brightest were going off for long periods of times at great distances. And it may have contributed to more assimilation. So we now have the situation where a man will have a wife, usually a Jewish woman, or considered Jewish by their standards, who would not come with him on his posting. She would be home because one of her duties, as in any Chinese home, would be to look after the parents. So she would be home, and he would take upon himself a second wife for this post. And that woman was presumably usually not Jewish. And we know that definitely that some people, not even officials, not even with that excuse, did have multiple wives among the Kaifeng Jews, and concubines, and so on. And at least into the end of the 17th century, the first wife was expected to be Jewish. Where they lived in Kaifeng, they were not segregated, although they tended, as we see in most Jewish communities all over, they tended towards living near each other in a neighborhood for the sake of it being easier and more comfortable. You're closer to the synagogue, you're closer to the mikveh, and so on and so forth. And here I think I have yes. So this is Kaifeng. Foreigners and the very poor lived outside the walls of the city. In the middle, we have the Forbidden City, and that's where the emperor lived with his close family. And then we have the inner city, where other relatives and court officials were living. And then we get the outer city, which is for the general population and business. And I've got the map on. And the Jews lived in the eastern part of the outer city, near one of these two gates. That was their general area. That is the Forbidden City. That's the palace of the emperor. And this is Earth Street, inside the walls, but in the outer city. And this is where the Jews were living. And the synagogue is someplace on the right, but I can't see it in the picture. And the Jews were sometimes known as the Jiaojun Jiao, the sinew-plucking sect, because, of course, in a kosher, in kosher meat, the hindquarters of the animal, which has the sinews, either you don't eat that part at all, or you have to remove them. And so that's how they were sometimes identified. And they enjoyed a sort of a golden age toward the end of the 14th century, when the Chinese established the Ming Dynasty. There are your dates for the Ming Dynasty. And because I was showing you Sung Dynasty, this is much more familiar porcelain for you, the blue and white, the famous blue and white, which influenced Europeans, Delft pottery, for instance, you know, blue and white. Just to give you an idea of the cultural side of their life there. In 1421, they got permission to rebuild a synagogue and add new buildings. And it took a long time for the completion, but in honor of it, the community erected a monument, a stone monument in the courtyard. And that is the first written document, this stone, that was left by the Kaifeng community, and it's our main source of its early history. Now, these are the dates of the various inscriptions, the various stones. And you can, as I wrote, they even mention things like stories out of the Torah and so on. So there's a Jewish content in that. And that's what the early ones looked like. Probably during the early Ming period, they started to use Chinese names. You remember that the name of the man that ran into Ricci had a Chinese name, Aijian. And by the mid-17th century, this middle of the 1600s, only 7 surnames remained in use. Anyone who didn't have one of those names was not considered Jewish. And let's see. Those are the Chinese names listed, and that's in a Chinese prayer book, in a Kaifeng prayer book. And those are the names. If you ran into somebody whose last name was Zhao, it was like running into somebody whose last name is Levine or Cohen or something. You knew he was Jewish. And just to mention, there was a major flood in 1642, and the population of Kaifeng, both general and Jewish, was reduced terribly, so that when you get a smaller number of Jewish names because of the great loss of life during that period. And it took them a very, very long time. They rented a house on the other side of the river. This was the Yellow River overflowing in a terrible way. And it took about 10 years for them to be able to get back to living where they had been living. In the meantime, they carried out their prayers on the other side of the river. During this period, when they came back and recopied Torah scrolls and put everything back together again, a memorial book was completed, and that was in Chinese and in Hebrew, and it told all sorts of stories about their lives and their practice, and they gave a whole list of the people who had died, and if they mentioned a woman who was not Jewish, then she would be identified as a daughter of Adam. There's a wonderful description of the community by two Jesuit missionaries in the early 18th century, and you have that on your sheets. I have a bit of it here. They used truly Hebrew letters, which they learn to read from boyhood, and many even to write. They call the 5 books the Torah, or Pentateuch, of Moses, by their proper Hebrew names, Bereshit, for Genesis, and so on. They retain circumcision on the 8th day after birth, the Passover, and so on. They keep Sabbath superstitiously, to the extent that they do not even light a fire of cooking food. And that's these two missionaries, who actually visited Kaifeng at that time. And probably the peak of Kaifeng Jewish life in the 18th century had about 2,000 people, about 2,000 Jews, just to give you an idea of how many people we're talking about. And then we gradually get the decline of both Kaifeng and of the Jews. The identity of the Kaifeng Jews continued right into the 20th century, even though very much diminished. I have a couple of photographs, probably from the turn of the last century. So they gradually become more marginalized, they're impoverished, they can't keep up their religious observances. The last rabbi died in 1810, so they were without a spiritual leader and someone who knew Hebrew for a very, very long time. Before World War II, there were probably 200 or 300 Jewish families in Kaifeng. Today, there are probably no more than about 100 families who identify themselves as Jews. And this is where I get to what we will call my segue. On March 13th, 1900, a letter from 46 Shanghai Jews was sent to the Jewish community of Kaifeng. They said, send an emissary, list your needs, how can we help? They set up a society for the rescue of the Chinese Jews. They tried to help, they offered to help rebuild the synagogue, for example, but failed. And other things were going on at that time. They offered, if anybody wanted to come from Kaifeng and worked in one of the businesses owned by the Shanghai Jews, we'll give them jobs. But I don't think much came of it. And it was a very, very difficult time. We said March 1900. So if you think about the next few years, we get terrible pogroms, one after another, in Kishinev and in Gomel and so on and so forth in the Russian Empire. We get the Russo-Japanese War happening, and so on and so forth. And so world Jewry was busy worrying about other kinds of Jews in other places besides the Jews of Kaifeng, whom nobody had ever heard of. But the Shanghai Jews knew about them, And so this brings us to the Shanghai Jews, and who were they? 1900, who were the Jews in Shanghai? So let me give you just a very brief history of what was happening in Shanghai. Until the 19th century, you know, Shanghai is an absolutely major city today, but until the 19th century, it was a small trading port. It was just another one of the little ports on the Yellow, but it had a deep harbor. And it was at the southern tip of the Yangtze River. Shanghai? Okay. Remember Ningbo and Nanjing? These are all, oh, and you've all heard of Wuhan, of course, from COVID fame. So there's Shanghai. Chinese trade was fairly low. Traditionally, foreigners would export porcelain, hangchows, tea, suchows, silk. That's what they would buy up in China and for export. And they would pay for it in silver. And very few products were imported into China. So the balance of trade, which we're all very involved in these days, was, as now, in China's favor. All right, this is an old story. However, in the 19th century, the best available medicine to treat pain and to calm anxiety was opium. Aspirin was only patented in 1899. And opium was grown in British India. And many, we're not going to talk about Indian Jews today, but many Jews made a lot of money in India growing and exporting opium. They were involved in the opium trade. It was legal. So opium was grown in British India, and they wanted to sell it to China against China's wishes, quite understandably. Nearly 1/3 of the trade of Bombay's entire trade was tied to the state-sanctioned opium business. It was major business, major enough that, as you know, there were wars fought over it. The first Opium War was in 1839 with the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. And as a result of that treaty, China was given no choice. They opened 5 ports. And those are the ports that are in red. Okay? So there's Shanghai, Ningbo, and so on. Okay? Those are the first ones. And there was a later one and a later war and more harbors opened. Because Shanghai had such a deep harbor, by the end of the 1840s, it had become one of the great ports of the world. It handled more tonnage than London. I mean, this is really quite remarkable. Within just a few years of the first Opium War. So lots of foreigners moved in there, lots of them, from all over, and among them, Jews. The city's foreigners lived in what were called 3 concessions, or sections, or areas of Shanghai: British, American, and French. Those were the 3 sections. After 1863, the British and Americans, who, after all, did share a language, although one can't always tell it, they joined together to have one concession, and the French, being French, kept theirs separate. So that's a map showing you the international settlement, that's British and Americans, and others will join them, and the French, who had their own. So the French had their own government, their own police force. And so more people poured into the international one than to the French one. And these foreigners built their own hotels, clubs, restaurants, schools, hospitals, parks. An entire culture grew up in the middle of the 19th century in this area of Shanghai. They published their own newspapers, they had their own postal service. They were like an independent country within Shanghai. And the British and a small community of Jews, most of whom were British subjects, they dominated foreign society within Shanghai. Now, the Jewish presence had begun there in the 1840s, just like everybody else. They came from China on business. In 1844, shortly after they established a community of their own. The first Jewish cemetery was established a lot later, 1862, and its first synagogue 15 years later in 1887. And this is the synagogue that was established. Really a fine, solid building. Obviously, a lot of money went into building this, and then the interior was simple. So that's the first synagogue in Shanghai. Originally, the Jews that came there were what we call Baghdadi Jews. That is originally from what today would be Iraq, and from the city of Baghdad. However, many of the Baghdadi Jews, because of political considerations that, again, we won't go into here, had left Baghdad and gone to India and settled in Bombay. So that by the middle of the 19th century, there was a sizable congregation, a group of very wealthy Baghdadi Jews living in Bombay, in India. Some of them fabulously wealthy. And it's some of these descendants who then jumped over to China to open up new opportunities there. First, obviously the opium trade, that was important, but other things as well. And so I'd like to just introduce you to some of the main characters in the Shanghai Jewish community of the 19th and going into the 20th century. Elias Sassoon arrived in Shanghai in 1849. It took 70 days to make the trip by ship from Bombay to China. He sold opium and spices and Indian wool. He bought silk and tea and animal hides for export, and he built up a hugely successful business. Well, let me show you what this famous guy looked like. All right. First of all, let me introduce you to David Sassoon. He was the original Iraqi Jew from Baghdad who came and settled in Bombay and set up this incredible business and community. And this is Elias, this is his son. And this guy comes to Shanghai in the 1840s. He's going to look a bit different. There he is, all, you know, westernized, although he's in the Far East. So that's Elias Sassoon. And his grandson is another famous Sassoon, Victor Sassoon, obviously looking like a playboy of the East, kind of. And he owned a lot of real estate. For example, he built the Cafe Hotel in Shanghai. I think I have the interior here. Very, very grand hotel. And just two pictures to show you what this very busy street in Shanghai in the international concession looked like. The Bund. It's along the water. And this is when we already have photographs, so it makes it easier for us. And you can see, it's a very old photograph, but you can see the street scene on the Bund. And another famous person who joins the Jewish community is a poor relative of the Sassoons, born and brought up in Baghdad. His widowed mother doesn't know what to do about him, and so she asks her distant cousin in China to give her boy a chance to develop his business skills. And boy, did he develop his business skills. His name is Eli Kaduri. And there are his dates. And this is him with two of his sons. And Eli Kaduri really, really made good. His home was known as Marble Hall. This is in Shanghai. This is unheard of splendor. This is the ballroom in his splendid home. And he is the one who built the famous Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong. If any of you have been there, it is still there, and it is still owned by the Kaduri family. Yeah. And an interior shot. So these people invested their time and their hard labor, and it really paid. Eventually, these Baghdadis diversified. They didn't just stick with opium. In fact, they left it. They went to real estate. They manufactured cotton and so on. And they were hugely successful in Shanghai. Now, there are other Jews and obviously other people who were not Jewish who made fortunes in Shanghai. But we're not going to go into that now. In the 20th century, which we're now in, we have other Jews coming to China for different reasons. At the very beginning of the century, we have Jews streaming into China, mostly in the north, for various reasons, partly the series of pogroms that I just mentioned to you, and some of them came to Shanghai, and by 1907, there were apparently enough of them to build their own synagogue. Don't forget, the Baghdadis are not Ashkenazi Jews. They're Iraqi Jews. They're not Sfaradim, because they never went through Spain. They're Iraqi Jews. And the Ashkenazi Jews built themselves a less splendid, but a perfectly all right synagogue, which is today a museum. So some of these Jews are coming in for a variety of reasons. And also, after the Bolshevik Revolution, we're getting a lot of white Russians coming in. You know what I mean by white Russians? The Bolsheviks are red Russians. The white Russians are the ones who want the Tsar back, who want to, turn back the clock. They're against the revolution. Obviously, they're not going to do well under the Bolsheviks. And so some of them decide, instead of going to Paris, which many of them did, or coming to the United States, they decide to come to Shanghai. And many of them come to live in the French concession, because there is this connection historically between the French and the Russians, language and various other reasons. And they bring with them all sorts of Russian music, ballet, poetry, and also, of course, prostitution, and spies, and shady nightclub owners. So it's a strange and wonderful mix that we get of Russians coming into the French concession. And then there's this long process of Jews, going back to Jews, migrating to China from Russia for various reasons. The first one that I want to mention is Harbin. Harbin, that's Harbin, way up in Manchuria. But you can see, close to Russia. And some of them have come over with the building of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Some of them were engineers or involved in that. Some of them were soldiers during the Russo-Japanese War and simply decided to stay over there instead of going back to Russia, which was in tumult at the time. So there are various reasons that these Jews decide not to return to Russia. And here they are, nice-looking Russian Jews, looking just like everybody else, and living in Harbin. And the community was relatively well off. They set up cultural institutions, synagogues, a cemetery, all the things that, a home for the aged, support for the sick and poor, all the wonderful things that Jews do in their communities after they're established. They did it there too. Sports organizations, publications, dramatic events, and so on. So they had this wonderful Russian Jewish community, but it's in Harbin. They were involved in lumber, coal, flour milling, soybean production, and so on. And they built a synagogue. Do I have a year for that? 1909. And this is now a concert hall. I mean, there's no Jewish community living there. And then a few years later, they built another synagogue. So obviously, well, that's the old Jewish joke. The man is on the island, and when they finally come to rescue them, a Jew is shipwrecked on an island, and when they finally come to rescue him, years later, there are two buildings on the island, and they say, "What is that?" You say, "Well, those are synagogues." And they say, "But you're just one person. Why do you have two synagogues?" And he says, "Well, that's mine, and that's the one I would never set foot in." Yeah. So obviously they needed a second one. The last Jews, as far as we know, left Harbin in 1963. By the way, just I'm almost finished, just an off comment. When we first came to Israel, my husband and I needed an insurance agent for our car, and somebody arranged it for us because we didn't know anybody. And this very nice man, Ike Ladar was his name, came and introduced himself, and we became quite friendly with him. And it turned out he was born in China and spoke Chinese, and he'd been born in Harbin. That was the first person I ever met, Jew, that was born in China. But one does meet others, obviously, because there were a lot of Jews whose lives ended up there or were saved there. In 1929, with the Depression, things got fairly bad for Harbin Jews, and many of them moved from Harbin to Shanghai, in fact. And then there was another Jewish community in Tianjin, which is the port city of Beijing. And so there was a smaller community, and there were between 2,500 and 5,000 Jews over the period. In 1937, they began to build a synagogue, and it was absolutely marvelous. Well, here are a group of Tianjin Jews, and the synagogue, Art Deco, built marvelous in 1939. And they lived in the British concession within Tianjin. And they were involved in the fur trade and diversified in various ways so that they weren't hit as badly by the Depression as the Harbin Jews were. But by the late 1930s, I have to remind you, Japan had taken over much of China already. So life is getting very, very complicated over there. And then finally, of course, we get to the 1930s, and Jews are suddenly discovering that they have to get out of Europe, certainly out of Germany, and then out of Austria, and basically out of every place during the worsening years of the 1930s. The first immigrants who came over from Germany were professionals who had lost their positions in their professions after a boycott against them in April 1933. And so in the autumn of 1933, 26 families, including 5 well-known physicians, came to Shanghai. By the spring of 1934, there were 80 physicians, surgeons, and dentists. Can you imagine? And then we start getting Austrian refugees arriving, victims of the Anschluss. And they arrived, the first group, in the Bien Camano early in September 1938. That's the ship they came on. And here we'll see them coming on the Conte Verde in December 1938. Here they are arriving in Shanghai on this enormous ship. And there's the Conte Verde. And this is the Razapass that the German Jews came on. And you'll see some interesting facets in this. First of all, the name of the man, Siegfried Friedberg, you see it's underlined, these two names are underlined, but he's got a middle name there. and that's Israel, because anybody who was a Jew that didn't have a clearly Jewish first name had to take on a middle name if you were a male, Israel, if you were female, Sarah. And so this clearly is the added name that he was forced to take on. The other thing to notice in this Reisepass, which is the passport that he was traveling with, is the red J that's stamped there, and that's for Jude, a Jew, identifying him. And that's somebody who came to Shanghai. Until October 1938, when the permit system was instituted, arrival in Shanghai by ship required only a valid passport and the price of a steamship ticket and a visa from the Chinese authorities, and not always that. It wasn't like coming into a country today where you need a visa. They were just pouring in. The situation of the Jews in 1930s Europe meant that many German and Austrian Jews were flowing towards Italian ports to get ships over to the Far East. And there are two heroic individuals that I should mention briefly. One is Ho Feng Shan, who was the consul general in Vienna during World War II. And at his own risk and against the orders of his superior, he issued thousands of visas in 1938 and after. Eventually, he was recalled to China in May 1940. It wasn't because you needed a visa to get into Shanghai, but it enabled them to leave Austria because they could show they had a visa. So that was one. And the other was a Japanese official, Shione Sugihara. Now, Kovna, between the wars, was the capital of Lithuania, of independent Lithuania. All right. It isn't now, obviously. It's Vilna, Vilnius. He became the vice consul of the Japanese consulate, and the Soviets occupied Kovna in the whole of Lithuania in 1940, and Polish and Russian Jews who were desperate to get out went to the Japanese embassy or consulate, and he issued thousands of transit visas, working 18 to 20 hours a day just to get them out for these poor people. And this is one of the documents issued by Sugihara. So we get this flood of refugees pouring into Shanghai on various ships. In all, about 20,000 Jews reached Shanghai, and their lives were saved during the Second World War. There was a lot of talk of chartering more ships because there weren't enough ships to bring them, but nobody got their act together fast enough to save more people. But these people, at least, were saved. In the beginning, the newcomers had to rely on the established Jewish community. We're talking about the Kaduris and the Sassoons and so on. And in various ways, they helped as much as they could by organizing things, by donating money. They founded places for refugees to stay, renting rooms out, the YMCA, and so on and so forth. They established the Kadoorie School for Refugee Children, which was taught in English, actually. Horace Kadoorie set up a Jewish Youth Association with sports and vocational training. So they made a huge effort, but there was just so much that these individuals could do. Victor Sassoon made available the ground floor of one of his skyscrapers, one of his luxury skyscrapers. He turned it over to be a refugee center so that when people first arrived, they could receive blankets and sheets and a tin cup and a spoon and a plate. So just to give you some image of these people who arrived in Shanghai. Oh, that's just to show you this huge distance that people were coming. These were nice, middle-class Jews coming out of Central Europe. In a list of professions in 1940, there were 1,100 merchants. Among these newcomers, 260 musicians, not surprising, 220 physicians, 180 dentists, and then about 1,000 Polish Jews came through Vilna and then Kobe in Japan, including 451 yeshiva students and rabbis. And that's just them arriving and getting their stuff together in the port. Now, there was pressure from the Germans because they wanted to do away with all these people, like they did away with all the other Jews. But there wasn't a serious effort. There were all kinds of plans, but fortunately, none of them came to fruition. And so there was a compromise. Don't forget, they were under Japanese rule in Shanghai, and the Japanese were allies of the Germans. And so what they agreed to was that they would ghettoize these new Jews that had come in, and maybe I think the other Jews too. They made what they called a special zone, or a designated area, with about 15,000 people in 1 square mile. Now, the word Jew was never mentioned. They were just referred to as stateless refugees. But that's who we're talking about. And then, so that was proclaimed in 1943 already. Officially, it was called a restricted area. And here are some women in the ghettoized area. These are German or Austrian Jews, most likely. And there was a police force. They needed a pass to leave, which was very, very difficult. Sadistic guards. This is one of the ghetto passports that was issued. It was unbelievably crowded. There was hunger, starvation, vitamin deficiency, tremendous hardships. But nevertheless, they carried on. And they had cafes, they had their music, they had schools, not at the pre-1943 level, but they set up schools for their children, and they managed, and they survived until the end of the war. And it is believed that some 20,000 Jews their lives were saved in Shanghai. There are lists and lists and lists. The person that you might know best, because he's a famous Harvard professor, and appears on television regularly about constitutional law is Lawrence Tribe, who was born in Shanghai of Russian parents. He wasn't from the group that had escaped from Germany. This was from the Russians who had come from northern China, probably Harbin or whatever, down to Shanghai. After the defeat of Japan in August 1945, obviously the ghetto was disbanded and most Jews left for various locations, including in 1948 the new state of Israel. So they had various options where they went to. Today there are very few Jews who have remained in China. The estimate is perhaps 2,000. And there is a commemorative stone in the park in Shanghai where the ghetto once stood. And so, in conclusion, I'm sure you all want to get out there and eat or enjoy the sunshine. Looking at the various groups of Jews in China, living there and flourishing, one is struck by their resilience, not just as human beings, but as Jews, their persistence in rebuilding their lives and maintaining the significant factors of Jewish existence, whether religious or cultural, synagogues and cemeteries, learned works, education of their young, sports clubs, scholastic and familial emphasis, the practice of endogamy, marrying within your community, circumcision, keeping the Sabbath, has somehow given Judaism a very long life. Their cohesiveness and feeling of responsibility for each other, their adaptability and their stubbornness. And one other factor explained by a Jew in modern-day Kaifeng, who was interviewed by Chris Buckley for the New York Times in 2016 in September. And this Kaifeng Jew, one of the ones that still survives, said to Buckley, "You don't recognize me as a Jew, but I recognize myself as a Jew, and that's what's most important. Judaism is all about endurance." Thank you. Thank you, thank you. It saved my life.
Yeah, we're going to leave just a few minutes for comments or questions. Hello. Thanks. Go ahead.
You don't have to ask questions. I mean, I've told you more than anybody needs to know.
By the way, Brenda Teller is our co-chair of Advocate, and she has.
Yeah, before we leave, I just have to make one mention of our next program. But anyway, my question was, I think you might have touched on it, but how difficult was it for the German Jews going over to Shanghai to get a visa?
No, they didn't need a visa to get into Shanghai, but their problem was proving to the Germans that they were going someplace. So that could be problematic. And that's why people like these two men that I mentioned, that's why they have why they were so very important.
Was it mainly people of means that had a lot of money that were able to get over to Shanghai?
That's a good question, and I honestly don't know the answer. They all look very middle class to me.
Yeah, you mentioned they all were, many of them were professional people.
Well, they had to leave because they couldn't practice their professions anymore. They had no choice. I mean, yeah, if you're working in a factory, unless they stop you from working there, you can keep going. Yeah.
And my last question, when they did get to Shanghai, were they allowed to pursue their profession?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I mean, they were doctors and dentists, so, I mean, if they had the means to set up shop, of course. I mean, yeah. Yes.
Cheryl?
She's got a microphone.
When I went there at one point, and there was, there were certain mementos. They showed remnants of Jewish stars on different places and everything. And I would just think some people were there for quite a number of years, and maybe even were brought up there. Sometimes was that their home in any way? I know there's a few people left, but did any stay? I guess China was very different at that point too, though, so maybe there was no place for them in this country. But it's been their home for what, some 10 years,
Well,
12
I mean,
years?
but it's more than 10 years because
More than that,
I
yeah.
don't know who you met. Maybe you met descendants of the Baghdadi Jews who've been living there for a century. I mean, the majority of Jews there were not the newcomers, probably. Yeah. I mean, it was a very mixed society at that point.
Yeah, it was interesting because and I would ask everywhere I was that if any if they knew of any Jewish people, and nobody I spoke to, guides, ever heard, oh no, there's no Jews in China whatsoever. And they were like certain about it. It's just interesting.
And
So I guess-
you ran into them?
No, I didn't. I mean, I only ran into the area that they had.
Well, you have to remember that it wasn't just that the war was over, but that the political situation in China was radically changing. And, for example, it was anti-religion.
Oh, that's right.
You know, so maintaining your Judaism was less comfortable than before. Yeah.
My question had to do with going back to the Khazars. Is it now established history versus theory that a group of people converted to Judaism?
Right. What are you asking?
There was a theory
Yes.
about a group of people who converted to Judaism. Is that now established history?
That as far as I know, that is the most widely accepted understanding of the Khazars. However, people don't think that necessarily all of the Khazars were Jewish, but certainly the ruling element was Jewish. So that, I mean, not only that, but there have been some very weird theories, including a book by, I can't remember his name, by a very well-known guy, who said that the Khazars were actually the origin of Ashkenazi Jews, which I find, and I think most serious scholars find, completely unacceptable. Yeah.
I was interested in that list of Jewish Chinese names. The one on top, Zhao.
Yes.
I mean, I'm no expert on Chinese names, so the only one I particularly noticed is Zhao. Well, Deng Xiaoping is a Chinese name that we've all heard of. Is there any connection between those two names?
I doubt it. Oh, she's making her way around to you.
So just a little update. I was in China in Shanghai, a couple other places. I was in China around 1998, I think, and specifically in Shanghai. And it was a women in technology group who, unbeknownst to us, the government, the communist government, thought we could bring major industries. So we were escorted around with sirens and we went to every kind of place. But one of the things that occurred was during Rosh Hashanah, and I specifically asked about things, and I was allowed to, had monitors everywhere. I was allowed to go to a Rosh Hashanah dinner. It was sort of it was a service. They imported a Hasidic rabbi, I think from Brooklyn. Anyway, in the women and men sets. But the only people there were expatriates, Jews who worked there. There were not any
Right. Not local.
Chinese
Right.
Jews.
Right.
The other thing was, this was shortly after, I believe it was Hillary Clinton went and visited, and they made a big thing of I think it was Rahel in one of the temples, the synagogues, and presented a Torah scroll. I don't know about a Torah, but she presented not a scroll, but a Torah cover, I'm sorry. And I was allowed to go see that and see a little bit of the synagogue, but there was no indication, like you said, it's all religious, and it was then too. It was at the beginning of the, I forget the name of the zones, they called the commercial zones, where they were trying to do a little bit of capitalist experimentation with IT and everything, but again, the only people I was allowed to meet were the expatriate Jews. So
Right, well, that makes sense.
I don't ever recall. I did get out. I did make a point of trying to walk without monitors.
No, I think the Sassoons and the Kadoris and so on
and
have very fine homes elsewhere.
right.
Yeah.
And I think there was also, wasn't Blumenthal from Shanghai? I mean, didn't he come over afterwards? He was born there, but anyway.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I just have a question about the Japanese. I understand the Jewish people were in a ghetto in Shanghai. I've read about it in many books. Was that in an area of a particular concession where they controlled the Jewish ghetto?
Well, it was in that same area.
Was it in the American-British concession, or was it in the French concession, or where was that ghetto actually?
As far as I know, it was contiguous to the British what they call the international concession.
So the Chinese people, they were not in these concessions, like people that
No,
they just lived in a different part of Shanghai.
absolutely.
Were they also, I imagine, very oppressed by the Japanese at that time?
Oh, yes. I
And-
mean, this was an occupying
Yeah,
force.
Right. So I understand it was very harsh, as you explained, for the Jewish people to even survive in those conditions. Of course, their lives were saved, but who helped them survive? Each other, or did you say the other?
Well, I mean,
more established Jewish families that
the
were there?
established Jewish community and the international Jewish community did send help. There was help that somehow got through from some of the international Jewish organizations.
Because the Japanese, did they actually put some of the Jewish people like in an internal camp?
Yeah.
Is that possible also? Not just the ghetto, but in a camp.
There were some camps that some of the local older population of Jews, the Iraqi Jews, some of them ended up in camps. They weren't put in the ghetto with all these Middle European Jews. So, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for today.
mesmerizing. Do you think you'll enjoy it?
Hello, before you leave our next program, let me just give you a few.